I am delighted to welcome Dr. Peter Webster to give our 2020 Liddon Lecture. He's an independent scholar based in the United Kingdom. He's written widely on religious history in 20th century Britain, and he's going to speak to us, as the title says, on the theology, the theologian and the church, Eric Mascall and the Sixties. Peter, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you ever so much, Andrew. Thank you to all of you for giving up your afternoon to come and listen to this talk. I'm very grateful to the Society for their invitation to speak to you today, and to Andrew for taking on the duties of chairing and managing the technology. This is great. I shall speak for around about 40 minutes or so. That's what I've got. That's what I have. As Andrew said, I'm delighted to take questions at the end of that. There are a number of slides. But the last one of them occurs about a third of the way into the paper. So if the slides don't seem to be moving on, this is not a technical hitch, it's just where we've got to. So anyway, onwards. So historians of theology have tended to like moments of controversy in the past. This is at least in part because the heat of dispute tends, in retrospect at least, to reveal with some clarity sometimes the fundamental issues that are at stake at any one time. The 1860 publication of Essays and Reviews is a paradigm case, for instance. But for more recent examples, we need only look at the sound and fury generated by such books as Soundings, 1962, Objections to Christian Belief, 1963, John A.T. Robinson's Honest to God of the same year, and later The Myth of God Incarnate, 1977. And if you can move the slides on here, Andrew, you should see some of those. Other scholars, whilst leaving aside the excitement of these particular moments, have still focused on longer-term themes in the history of theological ideas themselves, the Incarnation, for instance, the Trinity, and so on. Other historians have tended to think in terms of the three schools, Catholic, evangelical, liberal, that have provided the most common framework in which to think about the Church of England and its history. This much is about the content of theology, however. But there is another angle which has so far been rather under-investigated by historians, I think, and that's the institutional and social settings in which theology was written, spoken, read, and heard. Among those institutions, only a very few of the Anglican theological colleges have their historians so far, for instance. The history of the universities, as they expanded from the 1960s, has dealt with the secularization of the institution as a whole, but rather less with the position of the study of theology or divinity in particular within the university. There is as yet no equivalent for the post-war period of Daniel Inman's study of Oxford theology before 1945. But the relationship between the church as an institution and its theologians in their working contexts has shifted continually throughout the history of the churches, and it frames and conditions the development of all of the specific doctrines that have been so well studied. This relationship itself, however, the theology of theology, or the ecclesiology of theology, if you like, has seldom been examined directly, and hardly at all, for the period since 1945. And so it's about this particular relationship and the thought and career of E.L. Mascall in particular that I want to speak today. Next slide, please, Andrew, if you would. I shall suggest in a moment that the position that Eric Mascall occupied in his professional life provides us with a distinctive vantage point from which to think about the nature of the theological enterprise. His career was a long one and encompassed first the fall between the walls of a certain kind of optimistic, even rather complacent liberalism, and then the rise of a more radical post-war descendant, of which books such as Soundings or Honest to God were but a popularization. Both of these he rejected. In the late 1930s, Mascall saw the demise of that kind of liberalism epitomized by the modern Churchmen's Union, and emerged from the resulting philosophical vacuum with a new set of tools derived from the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. And the sequence of substantial books that Mascall then produced in the 1940s and 50s, the ones that you're most likely to see in print still, Christ the Christian, the Church, Corpus Christi, and others. These are the product of what Rowan Williams called an integrative passion. that was relatively uncommon in Anglican writing, but is a hallmark of Thomist thought. Mascall's project was one of synthesis, of placing the whole range of Catholic doctrine on a renewed footing. And as I shall show, his fire in the 1960s and 70s was increasingly directed against a kind of liberalism, though, which inflected differently, bore much resemblance to that which he had thought he'd seen safely buried in the 1930s. To take Rowan Williams's description again, this was a broadly Christocentric, but not Chalcedonian, morally serious, doctrinally agnostic theism, which seemed by the late 1970s to have triumphed comprehensively in professional English theology, in which environment then Mascall cut an increasingly isolated figure. Mascall was not alone in seeing the 1976 report of the Doctrine Commission of the Church of England as evidence of a complete disorientation amongst the most senior academic theologians in the land. Almost all of Mascall's career was spent in institutions of theological teaching and research. After ordination, followed by a short period of ministry in London parishes, he was first sub-warden of Lincoln Theological College from 1937 until his removal to Christ Church, Oxford in 1945. Mascall was to move only once more, then from Oxford to King's College, London in 1962 to take up the new chair of historical theology, from which position he then retired in 1973. However, his position was rather more complex and interstitial, if you like, than this progression might seem to suggest. Mascall spoke of his vocation as one of a priest being worked out in an academic setting, rather than that of a scholar for whom being in holy orders was professionally convenient. And in each professional setting, he retained some measure of contact with the pastoral and worshipping life of the church. As clerical student of Christ Church, his pastoral responsibilities were for the undergraduate body. While he was in London, he lived in the clergy house of the Church of St Mary, Bourne Street, and acted as assistant priest. The dedication of his 1980 book, Whatever Happened to the Human Mind, was to, quote, the priests and people of St Mary's in Pimlico, who for many years have provided this grateful author with an altar and a home. And these two lives, the academic and the pastoral, didn't merely run on parallel tracks, but were in Mascall's mind very clearly conjoined. And that connection was recognised shortly after his retirement, when in 1974, Mascall was appointed honorary canon theologian and unofficial theological advisor to the Diocese of Truro by his longtime friend, Graham Leonard, recently made bishop. But in Mascall's mind, the connection had been made throughout his career by his membership from 1939 of the quasi-monastic Oratory of the Good Shepherd. He described the oratory in his memoir as, quote, the chief controlling influence in my subsequent life. And the fourth of the 7 notes or principles of the oratory referred to, quote, the labour of the mind. Members were to endeavour to worship God with their minds as well as with heart and soul. They will be fearless in following truth and will constantly try to express it so that Christ may be as fully presented as thought and word allow. Each brother will seek, according to his ability, to bring new thought and knowledge under the discipline of Christ and to interpret them to a better understanding of the loving purposes of God. End quote. And so the whole of Mascall's career, I think, is a working out of this particular obligation in the situations in which he found himself. Even allowing for the natural exuberance of publishers, it wasn't unjust for one of them to describe Mascall in 1977 as among the foremost theological writers of our time. Alongside more than 36 books, published over more than 40 years, Mascall also produced more than 100 scholarly articles and an even greater number of book reviews. Yet, Mascall's reputation amongst historians of the discipline has suffered for the want of a single new idea associated with him in particular, a particular doctrine radically restated, some innovation in method, the creation of an overarching system. As Hugh Parry Owen, a former colleague at King's College, noted, Mascall produced no summa, no single book that encapsulated his whole work. It is arguably his philosophical work which now has greatest claim to be read still, by which I mean the 2 early books, He Who Is and Existence and Analogy from the 1940s, and the later The Openness of Being. But in theology, at least, the verdict of Brian Hebblethwaite in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography that Mascall's work was hardly original is largely a fair one, I think. But I doubt that Mascall himself would have been at all worried by that description, once describing his project as he did as one of higher vulgarization, an attempt to restate the core of classic Christian doctrine in a manner that could be grasped by those who most needed to grasp it, that is, the whole body of Christians. Next slide, please, Andrew, if you would. Mascall's work was also that of a critic, refiner, a clarifier, which influences an academic discipline in ways that are harder for the historian to see. And from the early 1960s onwards, in particular, his attention shifted from the writing of large original works to shorter books that engaged directly with the work of others. And it's these that I'm concentrating on today. Between 1963 and 1980, he published a sequence of 3 books, all of which in their way tried to counter trends in contemporary theology, which Mascall saw as highly dangerous. Up and Down in Adria, 1963, was a response to Soundings, Essays Concerning Christian Understanding, published the previous year and edited by Alec Vidler. The Secularization of Christianity, 1965, was a response to Honest to God and to The Secular Meaning of the Gospel by the American theologian Paul Van Buren. Theology in the Gospel of Christ, 1977, was a more general critique of the theological scene, but contained nonetheless a lengthy dissection of Maurice Wiles's The Remaking of Christian Doctrine, as well as an appendix added almost as the manuscript went to press, dealing with the myth of God incarnate, edited by John Hick, which had just been published. And these 3 were then supplemented in 1980 by Whatever Happened to the Human Mind, a particular target of which was the 1976 Bampton Lectures by G.W.H. Lamp, which had been published as God as Spirit. So I'm not going to go into the detail of the Mascall's critique of the doctrinal content of each of these works, although they form part of a more general unsettlement in understandings of the nature and limits of Christian knowledge, the treatment of the Bible and Christology in particular, that is actually ripe for further historical work. However, taken as a group, Mascall's interventions here do reveal with particular clarity his understanding of the role of the theologian and his or her, although they were practically all male, relationship with the church and with the universities. And so, next slide, please, Andrew. This gives you, folks, the general. These are my 5 themes. I will move through these roughly in this order, although they kind of overlap and loop backwards and forwards as we go. So, I'm not going to go very far into Mascall's very highly developed metaphysics, which you may be pleased to hear, but I do need to make some reference to it as it's foundational to everything else that I'm going to talk about. As I've said, Mascall's whole theological and philosophical scheme was the product of his rejection in the early 40s, both of liberalism as he understood it, we could talk about how correctly he understood it if you like, and also of the continental Protestantism exemplified by Karl Barth. Instead, as I've said, he embraced Thomism as containing a metaphysical system that could encompass and govern the whole sphere of theological inquiry. From Aquinas, he learned that the human being was dependent on the continual action of God for his or her very existence. God had not withdrawn from creation and left an autonomous being to his or her own devices in a clockwork world. All finite beings, quote, exist simply and entirely because they are being incessantly created, conserved, and energized by God, because they are radically and totally dependent upon the creative activity of being, capital B. And this relationship then entailed a fundamental openness of man's being to God's activity. Contrary to Barth in particular, for Mascall, the effects of the fall had not erected an insuperable barrier between creator and creature. Grace was not merely something that had to be imputed to men and women by God because in their fallen state they were incapable of actually receiving it. No, not for Mascall. Nature was not closed off in this ruined state. Grace perfects nature rather than destroying it, and as such, human apprehension of the truth was a function of the ongoing action of grace. Grace brought about not the replacement of a ruined nature, but a process of expansion, development, perfection, the realization of hitherto unsuspected potentialities, a new infusion of the creative activity of God. And this then was an ongoing process at God's initiative, with the rational mind not leading, but critically cooperating with it in a gradual ascent towards the beatific vision of God. And it was only, or at least supremely, within the church, the body of Christ, that this process could take place. So I say there's a lot in there. If you want to follow up any of this, Mascall's exposition of this is in his book, The Importance of Being Human, from the late 1950s. Mascall gave two detailed expositions of what he thought the ideal relationship was between theologian and church. One in 1946, towards the end of Christ, the Christian and the Church, and the second 30 years later in Theology and the Gospel of Christ. And in essence, the two are the same. Mascall's view of the competence of natural theology, that is, inquiry into issues such as the existence of God, was that it, in principle, was autonomous of revelation. It could be a pursuit of the unaided human reason, if not quite in practice. Not so, however, with theology proper, by which Mascall meant the Trinity, salvation, the nature of the church, and so on, which was an activity enabled by grace and given meaning by the church. The instrument that the theologian used here was not, as had been assumed, his rational faculty alone. Rather, he was to use his whole self in its sacramental union with Christ in his mystical body. He was to be used by the divine head of the mystical body as an organ through which some tiny fraction of the truth which is in Christ may be expressed more clearly. I should note, as saying here, that Mascall's language is not terribly inclusive, and so there's a lot of, but I retain it for its own, I retain it. It is likely that all, or nearly all, Christian theologians of Mascall's time would have assented to this as a general statement. However, as was often the case with Mascall in several different contexts, his detailed exposition of this doctrine of the theologian tended to raise it to a rather more exacting standard, something harder to comply with. Since the theologian was, quote, to express not just his own thoughts, but those that the divine head is thinking in his mystical body, of which the theologian is a member, the primary need of the theologian is that he should be living in the revelation itself. That is to say, he should be living in Christ. And what was Christ's body, the organism in which Christ, who is himself the revelation, manifested now upon earth, other than the church? And so the theologian was supremely a homo liturgicus, the liturgical man. Outside of the church, he could hardly be able to function, Mascall thought. But Mascall raises the bar even further here, still tending as he did to connect the health of a theologian's work with his or her personal worshipping life, natural development of the view of the relationship of grace and nature that I outlined earlier. The adequacy of a theologian's work would, quote, depend intimately on the maintenance and nourishment of his sacramental and moral union with Christ. It was not even enough simply to maintain a conscientious participation in the sacraments. Certain positive characteristics of intention were needed too: humility, faith, and adherence to Christ. And there was also danger here, not simply of inadequacy, but of actual harm. The theologian's work was bound to, quote, suffer disastrously if he falls into mortal sin, and even venial sins will impair it. The really great theologian must be a saint as well. And so the consequences were dire for the theologian who had fallen from grace and humility, since in doing so he would inevitably cause others to stumble. And as Mascall put it in the far from comfortable words of Christ himself from Matthew 18, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck and that he were drowned in the depths of the sea. There is a sense, then, in Mascall's polemic, although no names are named, that those theologians who arrived at the kinds of conclusions Mascall deplored could never have done so had their own personal relationship with the church, and through it with Christ himself, been in good order. However, those theologians that he criticised could hardly have recognised any such implied fault. Alec Vidler, for instance, the editor of Soundings, wrote in 1946 of the necessity that the Christian intellectual, in whichever field, be one who was rooted in private prayer and the worshipping life of the local church. Or take Howard Root, one of the authors of the Soundings volume, of whom Mascall was particularly critical, who devoted one of his Bampton lectures for 1972 to the subject of theological responsibility. He wrote of a number of theologians who covet both the word theologian and the adjective Christian, but who have gone freelance in terms of tradition and method. But, Root argued, theology is not a purely individualistic, personal affair. It has always, or nearly always, arisen from the work and life of the whole Christian community. So these men would surely have asserted that their own worshipping and prayer life was in perfectly good repair. Thank you very much, Dr. Mascall. And whatever else may be said of the kind of theology that Mascall rejected in the 60s, it could hardly be argued that it lacked earnestness. These men would most likely have maintained that they had simply followed where God, operating on their intellect by grace, had guided them. And if the result seemed to Mascall to contradict his understanding of what the tradition could encompass, then it was Mascall's understanding of the tradition that was incomplete and not any moral failure in those that he was reading. But it's against this very vivid sense of vitality and danger in Mascall that we have to read his particular polemics of the 60s and 70s, which I turn to now. We should take the directness, even brutality of Mascall's writing as an indication of the cosmic seriousness with which he took his vocation as a theologian. Although, as I understand it, a gentle and irenic character in person, although I myself never met him, Mascall was combative in print, and Vidler, Robinson and others must have felt cut down to size by Mascall's slashing pen. Yet he was conscious of the impression that this might give, recalling some discomfort at appearing to be what he described merely as a demolition agent. And so there were works in the same period, such as The Christian Universe of 1966 and Theology in the Future, 1968, which were intended as an exercise in construction. But his professed intention was always constructive, even in the more combative works. A favourite metaphor was that it was necessary to clear the ground in order to build better. A specific part of the critique related to the particular imperatives that applied to theology that was written for and marketed directly to a general readership, such as Honest to God, a book published in a paperback at 5 shillings, which reached its 5th impression within weeks and eventually sold hundreds of thousands of copies. And it was clear to Mascall that Robinson, quotes, was saying something which, if it was true, was very important, and therefore it was very important to find out what he was saying and whether it was true or not, end quotes. And so Robinson's 140 or so pages are given some 80 pages of forensic examination in the secularization of Christianity. Was such an examination really appropriate for a book of popular theology? Mascall thought so. The utmost care and precision in expression always necessary was particularly important, he thought, in popular writing, since, quotes, the readers, being less skilled in the subject, are less able to correct for themselves any mistakes into which the writer may have fallen. Such writing was, quotes, one of the most difficult of all forms of communication, but of all subjects, theology is that in which it is most important not to be slipshod. And in this regard, at least, Mascall practiced what he preached, I think, seldom writing a sentence that was less than lucid. Even if Mascall was prepared to look for whatever positive insight might be recovered from Robinson's obscurities, there was nothing positive about the movement of which he thought Robinson was part. Robinson and Van Buren were the outstanding expressions of what Mascall called a radical and destructive attitude to traditional Christianity, which has obtained a foothold in many academic circles. These revolutionaries had a psychological advantage, able to point to the Inquisition or Galileo, quote, to show without further argument that the radicals are always clear-headed and right, and the conservatives are always stupid and wrong. This was little less than a form of intellectual intimidation and blackmail. And by the late 70s, Mascall had connected this attitude within the academy with a more general polarization in the language used to discuss the whole of church life, a forcing of all voices into opposing camps of left-wing, courageous, liberal, radical, progressive and democratic, ranged against right-wing, cautious, conservative, traditional, reactionary and authoritarian. For Mascall, this was an importing of categories from the post-Vatican II Roman Church into an Anglican situation that didn't justify it. But it was also a drawing on the language of secular politics, which obliterated the wide variety of individual positions and tended to encourage conflict and bitterness where there should be dialogue and sympathy. Leaving aside the mode in which Mascall's young radicals expressed themselves, his view of Van Buren and Robinson was in fact rather similar to the conclusion that he'd reached in relation to Soundings 2 years before. Fundamentally, he thought the Soundings group had lost confidence in the tradition that they'd inherited as members of the church, and had instead reckoned the secular world's understanding of reality as a better foundation on which to rebuild. And that tradition may, at the present time, have largely lost touch with the world that surrounds it, Mascall argues, or perhaps we may prefer to say the world has largely lost touch with it. But the tradition, Mascall was convinced, quotes, holds all the resources that we need for this as for any other age. The task of the theologian was not, in Howard Root's phrase, beginning all over again, but to live within the tradition and to do all that is in his power to penetrate into its riches, and as evangelist and apologist, to do all that he can to integrate the life and thought of the contemporary world into it. So, it was natural for those who felt a vocation to theological work to gravitate towards the universities. After all, it was there where most others could be easily found with whom to discuss issues of note. The basic necessity of a well-stocked library was, with relatively few exceptions, to be found only in a university context. A report presented to the Church of England in 1968 noted a drain of the most able scholars towards the universities as those institutions expanded and required more staff. It wasn't inevitable that pulpit and pew should become disconnected under such circumstances, but for Mascall, the two had indeed become disconnected, which was a fact that had become notorious, if not indeed scandalous. End quote. Mascall was not alone in thinking so. In 1973, Charles Smythe, church historian and former canon of Westminster, referred to a common perception of a, quote, sheltered academic coterie or debating society, preoccupied with matters far from the mind of the embattled parish priest who face the materialism and indifference of our day and age. Mascall saw in this withdrawal a particular problem for the theologian who was also ordained as priest. Readers of Soundings would, he thought, quote, feel shocked and scandalized when they see how little guidance a group, all but one of whom are Anglican priests who either have or have recently had pastoral responsibilities, have to offer their contemporaries in the doctrinal and moral chaos of the present day. So in 1963, this is a passing observation, but by 1977, it had solidified in Mascall's mind into a sense that at least some scholar priests had lost sight of the correct shape of their vocation. At ordination, these men had undertaken to give themselves, quotes, wholly unto this office, and to draw all their cares and studies this way. Too many ordained theologians, he thought, had lost sight of the connection between their studies and the pastoral life of the church in which it took place. This was a loss of the right proportion, direction, and emphasis, thought Mascall. And although Mascall, surprisingly, given the thrust of his overall analysis, doesn't make this point, the case of John Robinson, not only priest, but bishop too, was particularly alarming. The unique shock of Honest to God was as much to do with who had written it as with what the book contained. Michael Ramsey, to whom it fell as Archbishop of Canterbury to deal with the affair, was not infrequently reminded by critics of his consecration vow to drive away strange and erroneous doctrine. Mascall's understanding of ecclesiology gave the worldwide episcopate the highest possible significance, and so that Robinson, no less a part of the universal apostolate than Saints Augustine or Athanasius had been, could produce such a book must have seen a fundamental contradiction of his office. For Mascall, there were also other institutional factors in play that were both cause and consequence of the kind of disintegration which he thought he saw happening. In the universities, important shifts in the position of theology as a discipline were already evident in the 1940s. The older universities, no longer committed to one particular denomination since the abolition of religious tests for admission, had good reason to avoid the subject of the intrinsic correctness of this or that doctrine. After all, these had been issues over which people had persecuted each other. To focus instead on the Bible solely as a historical text minimised the risk of what Mascall called theological embarrassments. As a result, according to the Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity at Oxford, N.P. Williams, writing in 1933, much of university theology had already become not so much the science of God as the science of men's thoughts about God. The study of the books of the Bible as texts, the history of dogma, liturgy, the institutional church, the study of subjective religious experience. Though for Mascall all of these were important, they were not, in the strict sense, theology, but rather sciences that bore upon it. All this Mascall noted in the 40s, and by 1977, when he returned to the subject, the situation he thought had grown worse. The balance between theology proper and its ancillaries had worsened, as in the syllabus of the University of London, from which he retired in 1963. The profile of the research theses that he saw being undertaken was also lopsided, away from systematic theology towards biblical studies and these other ancillary disciplines, as you thought of them. Outside the older universities, the faculties that did exist and the new ones that appeared, such as at Lancaster or Sussex, were more likely to be places in which theology had to share its space with religious studies. There had been something of a stir when the first chair of religious studies at Lancaster had been made available to candidates of any faith or none. Why, Mascall asked, had theologians acquiesced in all of this? Some, it seemed, had seen it as a necessary response to economic pressures and the changing attitude of the state. Theology was going to have to adjust if it expected a secular state to pay its bills. If the change had been inevitable for this reason, others had hoped that it might have the more positive side effect of strengthening theology's claim to neutrality and thus to a level of intellectual respectability. It had for a long time been the aim of thinkers within the liberal tradition that theology should come to be regarded as a human science, solely dependent on human reason, as were the other disciplines. Most corrosive, however, as Mascall saw it, was the positive enthusiasm with which some others welcomed the change. John Hick, Professor of Theology at Birmingham, editor of The Myth of God Incarnate, had written, looking forward to a future in which current differences between faiths would seem like nothing more than historic variations of emphasis within a single world religion. Given all of this, as far as Mascall was concerned, the absorption of theology into religious studies was no answer. It was these institutional pressures then that in Mascall's analysis had led to a systemic crisis in the relationship between church and theology as it was practiced in the universities. In 1977, it was not simply that the balance between theology and its ancillaries was uneven. Theology proper was now in imminent danger of becoming virtually extinct, he thought. The generations of theologians who had come after Mascall's own, by refusing apparently to address the truth claims of the matters they studied, had failed to convince their academic colleagues that Christianity had anything distinctive to say, either within the university or to the society outside it. For the church itself, the study that clergy in training underwent in the universities, Mascall thought, far from equipping them, instead tended to paralyse their prayer and eviscerate their preaching. And once the clergy had reached their parishes, they could expect little in the way of edification from the professional theologian or tools with which to deal with the issues he faced. Fundamentally, the church in its pastoral ministry was concerned with precisely the questions of theology properly understood, the redemption and glorification of man through the passion, death and resurrection of Christ. Once academic theology had decided to confine itself to the question of why men thought as they did about God, rather than whether what they thought about him was true, it ceased to be of any earthly use. So, Mascall, in this, as in almost all his writing, was careful to qualify his critique, and which I've given in its sharpest form here. And I'm not going to address whether I think it's quite justified historically, but that he had a sense of crisis was very clear, and it wasn't confined to the universities. Back again in 1933, N.P. Williams had held out the hope that even if the Queen of Sciences had been dethroned in the universities, she might yet find a home in the seminaries and other specifically ecclesiastical institutions. Mascall's time at Lincoln Theological College might have been a source of optimism in this regard. His colleagues had included the biblical scholar C.F. Evans and the moral theologian Brian Bentley, and his predecessor had been Michael Ramsey, who during his time as subordinate had produced the seminal 1936 study, The Gospel and the Catholic Church. However, the scholarly strength of the college's staff varied widely, as did their specific relationships with the nearby universities, if they had them. And that relationship came under specific examination in two reports, one in 1944, produced by a commission under the then Bishop of Durham, A.T.P. Williams, and again in the so-called de Bunsen report, which appeared in 1968 at a time of rapidly falling numbers of ordinands and thus costly excess capacity in the colleges. The de Bunsen report, while noting the shifting nature of theology in the universities, nonetheless concluded, as had the Durham one, that at least some of the colleges that survived any reorganization, and there would have to be one, would need to forge closer relationships with the universities. In this, Mascall saw no solution to the problem whatever. Far from thriving in partnership with the universities, quotes, "It is doubtful whether the theological colleges could continue to exist at all unless our ecclesiastical leaders and the church as a whole become more conscious than they appear to be at present of the inadequacy of academic theology as now understood to produce either a properly equipped pastoral clergy or a theologically educated body of Christian lay intellectuals." And although Mascall didn't develop the thought here, the need was for the colleges to become less, in fact, rather than more dependent on the universities. And for theology, an activity of the ecclesia to find its base and its support within the institutions of the church. So, just to conclude then, how accurate really was this gloomy picture that Mascall painted of the state of English theology at the end of the 70s? One generally sympathetic reviewer of theology in the Gospel of Christ thought that some of the language had been at least over-dramatic, even if the argument was sound. In any case, much basic research still remains to be done before we can answer that question, really, on the institutional history of the universities and colleges individually, and on the reception of theology by its readers. But accurate or otherwise, Mascall's argument is significant in its own right as an indication of the state of one particular strand of Anglican opinion. We ought to read Mascall's polemic as the work of an elderly man who had seen much of what he'd hoped for as a young man drift far out of reach. The confident Anglo-Catholic theology of the 40s, of which Mascall was part, along with figures such as Michael Ramsey, Austin Farrer and Gregory Dix, had not maintained its place as it had seemed that it might. Some of the certainties of the Anglo-Catholicism of the 40s and 50s had been upended by the Second Vatican Council, and the ecumenical movement seemed to Mascall to have been affected by the same disregard for theological rigour as he detected in the universities. In fact, the other lecture I thought about giving today would have been about Mascall's opposition to the failed scheme to reunite Anglican and Methodist churches in England, which would have drawn on several of the same themes. Certainly, the kind of theology that Mascall valued, although far from extinct in the years since 1980, hasn't recovered its role of framing and orientating the whole discipline and all the other kinds of studies that Mascall thought as ancillary to it. The transition of the theological departments and faculties to become those of theology and religion together is largely complete, and the history of the theological colleges has continued to be one of shrinkage and amalgamation, not least in the case of Lincoln, closed in 1995. It may be, however, though, really that Mascall was actually writing at the high watermark of the kind of liberalism that he deplored, at least within the Church of England. English theological history has gone off in all sorts of other directions since then. The growing influence of Anglican evangelical work, of the radical orthodoxy movement in recent years would suggest so. And a theological scene in the late 70s that produced both Rowan Williams and N.T. Wright can't have been quite as bad as Mascall made out. Be that as it may, Mascall's response to the theology of the 60s merits our attention still, I think. Not so much for the points of doctrine that Mascall set out to clarify and restate. Rather, what I think emerges from his work is an unusually detailed and coherent exposition of a Catholic understanding of the relationship of the body of Christ and the theologian, which was rarely so clearly as expressed as Mascall did. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Learned a lot more about theology than I ever history of theology than I ever thought I might in such a short time. Thank you. I don't know if we have it. I'm going to stop screen sharing so we can see everybody else. There we go. There we go. We have one question from a Mrs. Marjorie Roberts of my acquaintance. Was Mascall tempted to convert to the Roman Catholic Church?
That's a really so. I suspect that he was tempted quite a lot of the time. How close he got to making the move, I think, is rather less clear, because his view on, if you were to take, I was talking a little bit about his opposition to Anglican and Methodist reunion, and his heart is always pulling in a Romeward direction. And part of his objection with what's going on in pan-Protestant reunion is that he thought it would compromise and make a union both with Rome and with the Orthodox more difficult. And so that's always where he's being pulled. But if you were to take a look at a book like The Recovery of Unity, which is published in 1958, his criticism for aspects of Roman Catholic ecclesiology and theology is just as trenchant there as he is elsewhere, in that actually that he doesn't. Yes, so a great deal would have had to have changed within the Catholic Church, certainly that he encountered in the 30s and 40s, before moving could ever have been a practical option. However, he was still trying to work out what the long-term effects of the Second Vatican Council were. So much so that he was urging Michael Ramsey in the mid-60s to halt, or at least pause, a lot of what was going on in relation to the Methodist Church and the Church of Scotland and various other directions, in order to figure out what the council meant, in order to see if the two things could be better lined up. He didn't want things to slide too far in a Protestant direction when there seemed to be such revolutionary change happening in Rome. So the answer to Marjorie's question is, at a level, I think he's tempted quite a lot of the time. I'm not sure in his. That's it. I should say that I'm not quite sure where he got to in his very, very last years, long after retirement. But certainly in his active career, I don't think he got very close to making that kind of move.
Thank you.
Bob Rees has a question, and then I think Robert Gage wants to ask something. Bob Rees says, did Mascall ever engage with the theology of the Roman Catholic Karl Rahner?
Rahner, yes, he certainly did towards the end. So in some of the writing in the late 60s, he's certainly picking up Rahner as quite an important Catholic dialogue partner, because there's certainly philosophically there's quite a lot in Rahner's take on Aquinas, which he found to work with. So I forget which book most of it's in. There's some of that in, I think, in The Openness of Being, 1968. and in a couple of the later shorter works in the early 1970s. There's certainly some of that engagement there, yes.
Thank you. Did you want to ask a supplementary, Bob? Oh, you're on mute, Bob. Ah, success.
Thank you. Could I just follow that up a bit? Rana really wrote quite a lot about sort of Christian anthropology and what you could honestly believe about, in one particular context, about life after death, for example. And I would have thought Mascall took a rather different view of that. And I just wonder whether there was any discussion of that anywhere in Mascall's writings.
Oh, so it's a good question, which I'd have to go and follow up and get back to you on. I couldn't say definitively one way or the other. So I mean, Mascall's take on anthropology is set relatively early, and I think it's pretty much intact by the mid to late 50s, and obviously Rana's, and the bulk of Rana's work is rather than later than that.
Yeah. Okay.
Robert, you wanted to.
Thank you, Andrew. Peter, thank you very much indeed. I think this is the 20th Liddon Lecture that I have heard, and it's undoubtedly one of the very best. You spoke of Mascall being ironic in private, to a limited degree, I think. I remember Leslie Holden telling me that when he was chaplain of Trinity, this is probably in the late 60s, he'd published a short article, I think it was only one page, and I can't remember the journal in which it appeared, arguing basically that rather than having Trinitarianism, we ought to be arguing for Binitarianism. And on one Sunday evening after evensong, Eric Mascall and Austin Ferrer came and shut themselves in his rooms at Trinity and basically told him he'd got to recant, that he was going to wreck the church completely.
Oh, so I'll qualify my statement about Mascall in private then. I mean, of course, I never met him. I think I meant to say that actually, that I think he could be, so I mean, in debate, he could clearly be quite, the kind of episode that you talk about is clearly quite typical. But I think he was nonetheless a gentler in relationship than some of his writing might have suggested. I think that's all. I think that's the limit of what I want to say about it.
Thank you. We have a question from Philip Morton. Did Mascall express any opinion about the parish communion movement of the 30s and 40s?
Well, not directly. Only, but his emphasis is very Eucharistic, and so he could. So I think so I expect that he thought that there was little to criticise about it. If you see what I mean, does that make sense? That would be my sense. But I don't see him engage. Mascall tends to engage with the things he disagrees with, and you see an awful lot of that. And I think, in general terms, a greater recovery of regular parish communion would have been all to the good for him.
Thank you. And Philip Bovary asks, does it follow from what you said about Rome that he was a Thomist but not a neo-Thomist?
It depends what you mean by a neo-Thomist. So I understand that there's a great deal of debate about what exactly neo-Thomism is, and so if you define a neo-Thomist as one who doesn't is prepared to take on a Thomist framework but develop it rather than simply expound it in its original form, then he is clearly a neo-Thomist rather than a Thomist. But by and large, I mean, he was quite reluctant to own the label, as it happens, even though he's in fact viewed by Roman Catholic scholars as probably one of the most foremost, if not the foremost expositor of Thomas within the Church of England in the time. He was quite chary of taking the label lest it suggested that he thought that it wasn't so much a case that actually Thomas had given the last word on something, but more that he'd given the first word on which you could base subsequent development and if you see what I mean.
I don't know if Philip wants to ask any more about that. No, he's happy. William, you've got your hand up.
Yes. I could briefly make a couple of anecdotal remarks about Mascall's attitude to Catholicism in his last years, if you wish. And I know that Dr. Webster has undoubtedly read Mascall's last unpublished book manuscript in the archives of Pusey House, the overarching question, divine revelation or human invention. Which contains the remnants of what I think is an earlier version of the book, which includes a table of contents that includes things published as Jesus, who he is and how we know him, and the Trinitarian God. And I'm mentioning this because there's a fragment there too of fairly searching questions about the nature of Anglicanism, particularly the sort of the three-group idea of it. But I'll be quick if I can. I visited Mascall last on a Saturday early in August of 1992 in Seaford, and he was upset and emotionally expressive in a way that I had never seen him before. He was very upset about the bill then proceeding through the General Synod about the ordination of women. And on several occasions, he told me that at least as regards the episcopate and presbyterate, he was an impossibilist on the subject. He didn't believe that it could happen, even imagining that other Catholic communions accepted it themselves. And he talked a great deal, and I remember vividly his ending about that he was very upset about the bill. He knew what he would have to do if the bill went through, but he didn't know whether he would have the strength or the health to do it. And then he concluded, I hope I die first. And I didn't dare ask him, you know, what will you have to do and the like. And so it was left at that. Then when he died, I saw in the Times obituary that his literary executor was one Robert Gould, Colonel Robert Gould. I made some attempts to contact him, but all of it failed. And then a decade later, I learned through the assistance of the late Geoffrey Kirk that Robert Gould was in fact Father Robert Gould, who had been a priest in the Church of England until about 6 months before Mascall's death, that he had been Mascall's confessor at one point, that some 6 months before Mascall's death, he had become a Roman Catholic and was in fact a Roman Catholic priest of the Archdiocese of Southwark. And after further investigation, I found that he was in retirement at a priest's retirement home called Blackheath College. And I had one conversation with him in which he said, of course, Mascall was thinking about becoming a Roman Catholic. He believed that he couldn't stay in the Church of England once the ordination of women became a reality. But then, and this is a quote from Father Gould, he always took the authority of the bishops of the Church of England much more seriously than I did. And so when I decided to go, this was Gould, when I decided to go, I just went. Eric, he said, felt that he had to think the matter much more seriously through than I did. But then he began to have a series of debilitating strokes that left him with the attitude that he was no longer competent to make a decision in such matters, and so decided to stay where he was and leave the outcome to the mercy of God. Sorry for taking so much time to recount this.
No, it's very interesting, and I'd be interested to follow up with you about it. I mean, it doesn't surprise me at all. I think the point you make about him taking the authority of the bishops of the Church of England more seriously than Father Gould is a good one, because actually much of Mascall's Mascall had, I don't think, at the first moment's doubt that the bishops of the Church of England were Catholic in the fullest possible sense, and so actually he had no, I don't think he had any qualms over that as such, and so. And you're quite right to say, Annie, you're quite right to say that he is an impossibilist when it comes to women, the ordination of women. That actually, that even, as you said, even if all of Catholic Christendom were to accept this, ultimately it's an anthropological impossibility as far as he saw it. And so actually as for what it's worth, it made Mascall something of a figurehead in certain parts of the movement that opposed. And some of his writings in the late 60s and early 70s became kind of sort of fly sheets for some of that argument. But yes, so what you suggest about his very, very last days sounds entirely plausible to me.
If I may add, I mean, from the late 80s onwards, now I'm speaking more generally, he spoke of his, I think he used the word once, bemusement at the phenomenon of continuing Anglicanism. A number of continuing Anglican figures, particularly, I don't know whether he was, Louis Falk sought him out in the throughout the 80s, really. And he was bemused by this. I think he wished them well. But I think Mascall, if I could disagree, Mascall really didn't think of himself in some sense as an Anglican. He thought of himself as a priest of the Church of England, representing its essential Catholicity. And while he was very happy to lecture in South Africa and North America under Anglican auspices, I was never quite certain how seriously he took the Anglican communion as a thing, if I can put it that way.
So, I mean, I think that's quite plausible. I'm not sure we're quite disagreeing. I mean, the thing is that Mascall's ecclesiology, if you look at the recovery of unity, his ecclesiology is actually very, very much focused on the episcopate. And he rather thinks, that the national churches are in some ways a historical accident rather than being anything very fundamental, if you see what I mean. And so episcopal churches in the right succession, in a sense, actually are the fundamental unit as far as he sees it. And so there are cultural and pragmatic and administrative elements to being organised in certain ways above that, but fundamentally from at the fundamental level of what the church is. I think actually, so I'm not sure we're quite disagreeing, I think.
No, I don't think we are. And if I may make one more point, I think he never altered, so far as I know, his very narrow but pointed criticisms of the papacy in the last two chapters of the Recovery of Unity. Though I rather think, I'm going out, it was his attitude that shifted as he grew more and more gloomy about the nature and the future of Anglicanism and the Church of England. And since he was on terms of some personal friendship with Paul VI, whose Humanae Vitae he defended strongly, I suspect that his differences with Roman ecclesiology, I don't know, I can't say whether they were resolved or not, but they tended to shrink in importance, I might say, by comparison with his apprehensions about the future of Anglicanism and of the Church of England.
And I think, yes, and I think that apprehension is at the level of epistemology, in a sense, actually. So the quote you gave at the very, very beginning, which is about kind of, are we dealing ultimately with something of human invention or something of God's giving? And it is a kind of a phrase that crops up quite frequently, and he sees it, and so actually so the crisis in the Church of England isn't really about order. It's actually it's something more fundamental about the epistemological processes by which you all arrive at understandings of anything at all, if that makes sense.
I mean, he was quite dejected around 1984 that both Darton, Longman, and Todd and SPCK turned down that last manuscript. Particularly as he told me they had turned it down more because of its pervasive negative tone than for any other reason.
Thank you, William. Did William Jacob want to say something? I think I would.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
It was just really a comment on his time at Lincoln. I think that was an unusual experience of a theological college, because theology was pretty weak in most theological colleges, and Lincoln was unusual under Eric Abbott, who recruited, as you know, Eric Abbott, George Sims, as well as Mascall, and Bentley, and then subsequently Christopher Evans. And I remember Christopher Evans saying to me that Hoskins had said to him that when he was talking about ordination as an undergraduate, that he ought to go to Lincoln. It was the only place that took theology seriously. And you know, when you compare it with somewhere like Cuddesdon, where Eric Graham was, according to his biographer, in 1942, when he left to go to be Bishop of Brecon, still using the lectures that he had written when he was appointed to be vice principal of Salisbury in 1912. That's an interesting comment. But it must have been a curious common room at Lincoln, because you can't help thinking that, well, Mascall and Bentley were pretty sort of abrasive personalities, and that holding them together must have been quite tricky. And to what extent that helped to form or mellow or something or other Mascall strikes me as a very interesting question.
Which it is a very interesting question, hard to get at, other than Mascall's own account of it in the memoir. I think it's
very little, doesn't he?
Indeed. But I think given that the time at Lincoln is the point at which he's really laying the groundwork for what comes subsequently, that actually because you know, he didn't read theology, he read maths, and so he found himself in a slightly curious situation of first starting to write about the relationship between theology and natural science while he's still a curate, and by a process for which I haven't been able to get hold of, ends up getting the job as subordinate, despite not having any very, very obviously established theological kind of training. And so I think that those first years, he's rather only a chapter or two ahead in the textbook, if you see what I mean. And I suspect that the experience of being with those other men will have had that kind of, must have had a formative effect on him, but it's hard to document. But I think your more general point about the state of the theological colleges is a good one, and I think N.P. Williams writing in what he's expressing in 33 is a hope of what how things might change within the theological colleges, rather than a description of how things currently are. I don't know whether Andrew Chandler is still on the call. He might have something to say to that. But
I'm Queens that Andrew has written about was obviously not very impressive theologically, but nor were the provincial universities, and they were, well, extraordinarily small, and I suspect very largely sort of teacher training colleges, weren't they?
I think so. I don't know whether Daniel Inman wants to say any on that to you. I will defer to him on that.
I can't get my question on chat. I'm trying to.
Gillian, do you want to?
Yes, what I asked was Pascal influenced by Eastern Orthodox theology?
Oh yes, very definitely. And I haven't gone into this. He's very heavily
I've come
involved.
across his rhyme and that, yes.
Oh, so he's very heavily involved in the Fellowship of St. Alban and Sergius in the 30s
Yes,
and
yes, which I
40s.
belong to, yes.
Indeed, so well, very definitely. I mean, there's quite a lot to say about that, which I haven't gone into in as much depth as I have done so far. But that's definitely part of the makeup. Although he doesn't, although his natural theology remains Thomist rather than. And so he finds, so he's some way away from a figure such as Berdyaev and some of the other orthodox philosophers in that period as well. So there is an influence there, but I think it's ecumenical in focus, but I don't think it's quite intellectual in the same way.
No, he never thought of joining the Orthodox Church if he disapproved of women priests.
Not as far as I know. But
Thank you. Does anybody else want to ask any questions, make any comments? Robert Gage, I can spotted him.
Peter, it just occurs to me, on behalf of the Society of the Faith, are you aware of any contact, recorded contact between Eric Mascall and the Douglas brothers?
So I'm not. I wouldn't want to say it didn't happen. It doesn't. I can't recall it to mind.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't want to rule it out.
He did publish with the Faith Press, of course.
Of course, it is on several times, but I don't know how closely that brought him into contact with the Douglases. However,
Does anybody else wish to add any comments? I think it might be just unmute and shout out time. The risk of riots breaking out.
Can you hear me? It's Norman Morris.
Yes, we can.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I may have missed it, but did you comment at all on Eric Mascall's views on liturgy? Because he had great friendship with Michael Morton for a long time, over many years, who was at Exeter University, a very similar figure actually, being a priest working in a university. Michael Morton I was for a time his son-in-law, was very opposed to the ASB and changes going in that direction over decades. I just wondered if your researchers had, thrown up that connection and his views on liturgy.
To a degree. So he isn't a prayer book loyalist as such, in that I don't get the sense that he's attached to one liturgical form or another for aesthetic or historic reasons all that much. So he doesn't express himself on the ASB very much, but he does get very involved in he has lots to say on draft services at various stages in the revision process earlier, and many of his particular issues in relation to Anglican Methodist reunion revolve around what the services involved there do and don't say, and what they say and whether it's clear what they say and what they don't say. And so his interest in liturgy is, I don't think it's aesthetic. It is about whether it correctly expresses the realities that it's referring to, and he's very concerned that it should do. But it's an intellectual preoccupation rather than an aesthetic one. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, thank you very much. Because I mean, I think his emphases were, elsewhere. But it's interesting the links with, Michael Morton at University with liturgy and an opposition to, Anglican Methodist unity. It all sort of fits in. I did once have done, yeah.
So I mean, he becomes, for a while, there's a period of 2 or 3 years after the ASB comes into use, where there's a kind of loose conservative coalition that starts to begin to form, around various different issues. And so there are some who are concerned about women's ordination, and there are others who are concerned about the ASB, who get drawn temporarily into a kind of alliance. And so you see a number of kind of periodical issues, a number of edited books that start to get these voices coming together. And he does get drawn into that kind of area. So there's a book called When Will You Be Wise, which is edited by Tony Kilminster, who's secretary of the Prayer Book Society, and Mascall gets drawn into being a contributing author to that. So at that moment, there is a moment in which there's something looking like a conservative coalition starts to form, and then I think it then kind of fragments and goes different ways over time.
Thank you. And one last point. Are you aware of the Christmas letters he used to send out? I don't know whether you've seen them. They were extraordinary creations, actually, every Christmas.
No, I haven't seen any of them, but I did know about them.
Yes.
I should be, so if anyone has one, I should be interested to see them. But
yeah.
I should actually say that on my last slide, that my email address is on there. If anyone does actually have recollections of Mascall or other things to add, do please feel free to email me with them. I should be glad to have them.
Thank you.
If I can, when I went through Mascall's correspondence in the Pusey House archive in 2007, one of the things I was hoping to turn up were copies of his Christmas letters, but there are none there, unfortunately.
It's quite a thin archive. I mean, it's about 10 or 11 boxes, and a lot of it is drafts of books and various other things. And there's a certain amount of correspondence, but I don't think it represents anything like the bulk of what he sent and received.
Yes, there is an interesting 4 or 5 letters between him and Michael Ramsey, 1968 or 69. Which becomes a rather fraught correspondence on Mascall's part about the implications of the 1968 Lambeth Conference.
Well, I'd say I'm about to publish an article on Ramsey and Mascall and Anglican Methodist Union, a sort of a version of which is available on my website, which is also listed on the slide. And so yes, their relationship, which has been very, very cordial, well, better than cordial, really quite close for a number of years, comes under a great deal of strain in 1968, 1969. It seems to recover again, but there is so this isn't about Ramsey, but actually their different reactions to that scheme illustrate very clearly the differences in outlook between them in many ways.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any comments, thoughts? Well, rather like having to believe that there really are hosts of angels present when there's 2 of you at a midweek communion in a little church in the middle of nowhere, Peter's going to have to believe that we have all applauded widely and loudly and thanked him greatly for his lecture this afternoon. There's a couple of comments which I will send on to him in the chat box, which you may or may not have seen, that are very appreciative. Thank you very much indeed, Peter. I hope the rest of you have enjoyed this. In terms of feedback, if there's anything you want to feedback about the general experience of getting the ticket and joining Zoom and all that sort of thing, we would be grateful. Hopefully the next lecture will be face-to-face, but well, as everybody knows, Lord alone knows what will happen, and the Lord isn't necessarily telling us exactly. So thank you very much indeed. And I hope you all have, well, I think it's fairly safe to wish you all the best for Christmas. I think we're getting within Christmas good wishes time. I know the secular world's been doing that since mid-November, but with very best wishes from Society of the Faith and myself. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating lecture.
Well, thank you, William. Thank you, Andrew, and to everybody for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.